Operation Encore is a 501c nonprofit that is helping veterans turn into rock stars every single day. You can learn more about what Operation Encore is doing by going over to their website at www.operationencore.org. That is www.operationencore.org. If you can give them a hand, just click that little donate button or follow all of their social medias and learn exactly what they are doing to change the lives of our veterans every single day. Hey, welcome everybody to Drunk Dudes in a Gun Room. Man, there's a lot of new stuff that's coming down the pipe. I'm sure if y'all have been following my social media, you see that there's going to be some changes with the show coming up. I'm kind of excited about it. Starting off on a new year, new show, new name. So everything will be coming together. Today, we have got a topic that I don't know how many people are familiar with it. I personally was not very familiar with it until I came across Mr. Guiver's bio, and then it caught my attention, and I had to bring him on so we could discuss it, because I think there's a lot about history to be said. And the more we know where we came from, the different things that have happened in the past, the more we learn. So let's have John Guiver. John Guiver is an author who turned to writing after a career in the world of artificial intelligence and high-tech software. He has spent many years researching the 1972 Andes flight disaster, first as a hobby and then full-time, leading to the publication of a comprehensive history of the event, To Play the Game, which appeared in December 1972, the 50th anniversary of the return of the 16 survivors after 72 days lost in the mountains. Let's bring on John Guiver. How's it going?
Hey, Donald. Thanks for inviting me to your show.
Absolutely, man. So just in case some of the listeners are not familiar with this, give everybody kind of a quick background of what we're going to get into with the Andes accident.
Okay, so the 50,000-foot view of it is it's a Uruguayan rugby team. This is 1972. They set off to play a game in Chile, in Santiago. So they're going from Uruguay to Chile. So they're flying from east to west across South America. They hit some. They have navigational errors and hit some bad weather in the Andes. They drop out of the clouds and find themselves. The pilots are heading towards a 15,000-foot wall of rock and snow. They try to clear it. The wing clips a rock on the ridge. The wings come off. The tail comes off. Some of the passengers get sucked out of the back. But the fuselage amazingly lands on the other side of the ridge and toboggans down the mountain for about a mile. Ends up in a very remote snow-covered valley with mountains on all sides. And remarkably, at the point of the accident, there's still 33 out of the 45 passengers still alive. A terrible first night they spend. They believe they're going to get rescued. They have no way of contacting the outside world, and certainly rescue efforts sort of are put into, start immediately. But after 8 days, the rescue's called off because no one ever survives a crash in the Andes. Yeah. And so they're going to put it off for another 3 months until the summer comes. Anyway, to cut a long story short, we can get into some details later, but and there are all sorts of very interesting events that happen on the mountain. Like, for example, they have to resort to using the bodies of their friends for food, which is the most sort of publicized event, but it's one of many, many things. So 72 days later, two of the boys appear in the Chilean foothills of the Andes and are able to attract the attention across a mountain torrent of a cattle drover, high up in the foothills, and they've been trekking for 10 days. The cattle drover, he rides down the 30-40 miles to the nearest location on his mule, alerts the authorities, and then a rescue takes place. And by the end, there are 16 survivors out of the original 45 on the plane.
Wow. And almost to the number, 50% of what survived the initial impact.
Yeah,
Man.
yeah.
So let's back up a little bit. Let's dig into, how did your interest come with this? What attracted you to it? Was it rugby? Was you a fan of rugby?
Well, it was a number of things coming together, I think. So this event happened in 1972. When the survivors became aware of the sort of worldwide interest, they commissioned an author. It was actually a British author, Piers Paul Reed, to write the definitive authorized account of the story. Mm-hmm. Piers was a very serious, well, he was a fiction author, but this was his first sort of foray into nonfiction. But he wrote a remarkable book called Alive, and there was a film called Alive 20 years later that came out. Now, Piers actually, he was like the passengers, the rugby players. He was from a Catholic rugby playing school, and it happened to be the school that I went to.
Oh, wow.
As well. And although he was there 15 years before me, so I never knew him, but it sort of piqued my interest. And I went to the same rugby playing Catholic school. I also had, some Italian blood, so I had the sort of Latino sensibilities, maybe. Mm-hmm. And so I just devoured his book. I read it many times, but what can you do, right? You're interested in the story, but back in the day, there was no way to sort of get engaged with it. So then you sort of fast forward to 2013. It was I had a bit of disposable income for the first time. I saw that there was a trip that was run by an American-Mexican mountaineer called Ricardo Peña to the site of the accident. And I thought, oh, great, this is sort of the adventure holiday I'd love to go on. So I went on that. I met one of the survivors, a guy called Eduardo Strauch, who goes along on those trips. And I went again a couple of years later, and Eduardo introduced me to another survivor, a guy called Pedro Agorta. And I met up with him in Buenos Aires, and I told that he just published his memoir. So I said, Pedro, I'm going to translate your memoir into English. And he was very skeptical because I didn't speak a word of Spanish. But I set myself the task. I sort of learned some Spanish, and there are lots of good tools, and he speaks quite good English. So he if I had a question, I'd sort of ask him. But anyway, that got published in England in English speaking world in 2016, and through Pedro, really, I got to know a lot of other members of the community. I translated his cousin's book, who also wrote his memoir, and I started to meet more and more people. So, fast forward again a few years, I'd met all but one of the survivors. Some of them on very good, good terms and friendly with them, and I'd also met many of the families of those who died on the mountain, and that was the sort of bit that was largely missing from all the accounts up to this point. And I thought that was a really interesting aspect of the story because, and we can get into that later, but I want to stress the incredibly close-knit community that these passengers were from. So just to give you an idea of that, in the early 60s, by the early 60s, 26 out of the 40 passengers, there were 5 crew members, 26 out of the 40 passengers were going to the same small primary and middle school. So this was 10 years before the accident. So there's an incredible, community, and this is a small community. I mean, this is a neighborhood, quite a young neighborhood of about, that was established around 1950s, and with a few thousand people. So everyone knew everyone. So it wasn't just an accident. It was an accident where you had a bunch of people, who were really, really good friends and who knew each other, intimately. So it's such a rich story. So to, I guess, focus in a bit more on your question, there were two other sort of threads that really helped this along. One is when I translated Pedro's book, I contacted Piers Paul Reed, who wrote that original book Alive in 1974. And he gave me special access to his archival information because he'd interviewed the survivors in 1973, 2 months after they'd come back. He had some very rich material that, only part of it had sort of made its way into the book Alive. So I sort of became very, very knowledgeable on the actual survival story. Mm-hmm. And the other part was in sort of meeting the people who hadn't come back. As in this case, it's mainly the siblings, although in one case, it's a couple of cases, it's the children of those who died on the mountain. I started to get to know them very well, and I started interviewing them, and they started to open up about that time, which many of them had never spoken about. And so I sort of gradually had amassed this huge amount of information over a period of a few years.
I think not just how hard, I mean, all these people, like you said, they went to school together, they knew each other. So that first day now becomes even more hard because they're trying to figure out everything that just happened. They're taking account of their friends and their family members that passed away. But, imagine now how close the survivors are today, just because of the way trauma itself will bring people close. I mean, it's really common in the military that a lot of people that go to combat and go through things together, when they come back, they become lifelong friends. And it's just trauma.
Yeah, it's a very special relationship that they have. Yeah. And I don't think, you get people among the 16, although they're 14 now, two of them have died, one a few months ago, the other in 2015. They're extremely close, but they don't necessarily, some of them are buddies, but they're not necessarily all sort of buddies, but they get together, on a regular basis. They've all done many, many interviews together. They've been, elevated to a very high level. And it's something, I think at the time, one of them said we were closer than lovers. It was such a strong bond by that, those 72 days stuck together in that isolated situation.
Yeah. So let's go ahead and start digging into the flight. Would it make sense to start from the moment of the crash, or do we have to go back a little bit further?
Well, there are some things that are sort of maybe some sort of background and contextual information that's sort of important. That just a bit about the passengers first. So they'd all gone to the same school, largely. When they left school, now they were all, predominantly around in their early 20s. They'd left school. They'd started a rugby club called the Old Christians because the school was known as the Christian after the Irish Christian brothers who founded it. Okay. And the Old Christians actually, Uruguay, I mean, I know rugby is maybe not so popular in the States, but, in UK, it's extremely popular. And in South America, Uruguay, Argentina, and Chile, Brazil also. They were actually Uruguay in the time, it was all amateur, and it was amateur actually up until 2019. But they were an incredibly strong side. They'd won the Uruguayan championship, this sort of old boys team, the Old Christians, 2 out of the previous 3 or 4 years. So they were a really good team. Some of them were playing for the Uruguayan national team. And so, it was a chance. It was this wonderful chance to sort of fly to play a like-minded team in Chile, which you can imagine it's sort of flying like from Colorado to the West Coast or something like that. So you're crossing a big mountain range.
Yep.
So, everyone's in high spirits. I mean, it's a few days in Chile, you sample, the food, the wine, of course, go dancing and so on with the simpatica Chilean ladies and so on. So there's just such an air of optimism. And the first sort of thing that killed that off a little bit was that they when they got to the Andes, they're flying for about 2 or 3 hours before they get to the Andes. And then it's a very short hop over the Andes. The weather in the Andes, there was this massive cyclonic storm in the Andes, and they couldn't cross in the airplane they were in. Incidentally, the airplane was a chartered flight run by the Uruguayan Air Force.
Okay.
So it was, they were just them in the plane and the 5 crew. So they had to actually land at this Argentinian town just on the east side of the Andes and spend the night there, which sort of took a day out of their trip. So they weren't too pleased. But they stopped in Mendoza, which is... some of your listeners may know about Mendoza or may have been there. It's a beautiful town. It's, nowadays it's famous for the wine. It's a big wine center. And it's famous for, you get a lot of climbers going there because people who, have any pretensions to being, a good climber, they'll climb Aconcagua, which is close by. Before going on to the Himalayas. So it's a fantastic atmosphere there. But anyway, so they stopped there, and the next day the pilots weren't sure even whether they should go, because it's just like 100 miles across, but there was still the tail end of the storm. So what they decided to do was to make this massive detour. That's important to understand the accident. So the detour, if I try and do this in reverse, you go down from Mendoza south about 150 miles, and then you go across the Andes from east to west, and then you go north up to Santiago, the capital of Chile, which is where they were headed. And the pilots inexplicably turned north way too early, and they found themselves in the middle of the Andes. Okay. And well, then I described the accident a little bit. They had these series of they had a huge headwind. They had a series of air pockets. They came out the clouds. They hit the rocks. They tobogganed down. They spent the first night. Well, it was a terrible night. There were 33 of them. A large part of the back of the fuselage had come off, even though the floor was intact towards the back. The sort of the cover of the fuselage had been, had come off, going quite far forward, and they were sort of all trying to, crowd in, all on top of each other into this little space to escape the wind and the snow. There were many who were very badly injured. There were actually 5 people who died, over 5 or 6 who died over that first night. People were crying out in pain the whole night. It was something out of hell. And when they, got out the next morning and saw, their surroundings, because they crashed sort of late afternoon, so the darkness came quite quickly, and they only had a short amount of time to start organizing things. They were trying to get the seats out so they had more space in the fuselage. Terrible situation. But they saw they were, hemmed in on three sides by tall mountains. And the fourth side to the east, they believed would just led further into the mountains. But they set about sort of working and making things better for the second night. They, took more seats out. They took the dead bodies out of the plane. But they were very confident that they'd be rescued. I mean, why wouldn't they be rescued? I mean, it's crazy, right?
Well,
1972, yeah.
To answer that question, so I'm going through a few things over here, and just to give the listeners an idea, right? So, looking at the map, and when I do the editing, I'll add these maps and everything for people to see. But they, like you said, they went south, and they were below. I guess the plan was to come down and then come back up after they've crossed the Andes. Was their thought process that the storm, that they were going below where the storm was and coming back up? Is that what their thought was?
No, they didn't go down. They were supposed to go across at about 18,000 feet, and then once they reached the Chilean side, then it was a straight run into Santiago. But they turned too soon, and I have a very detailed analysis in my book of the accident and what I believe happened, which is quite a technical description, so it's a bit sort of difficult to go into here.
Yeah.
But I believe it was. I believe they had all their instrumentation at the time they turned north, and I believe they knew where they were. One of my hypotheses, I have to be very careful what I say here. One of my hypotheses is that this was a shortcut, a standard shortcut, and it was the combination of the shortcut that the military planes may have taken. Whether that's true or not, I can't definitively say. I'm not
right.
I'm not an aviation expert, although I did study in detail the instrumentation and the weather conditions and so on. But I think it was a combination of the decision of the pilots along with very adverse wind conditions where the headwind was much stronger than that both was reported to them and that they believed, that led to them losing their signal from the ground station. And once they lost their signal, they were flying blind, and it was a very precarious situation.
Yeah, and to give them an idea, so you ask how they can get so lost that they hit a mountain. Well, we're not talking about mountains like what we see in the United States. This mountain was right at 11,000 feet.
Well, they were at 50. No, the ridge they hit was at 15,000 feet. That's where the fuselage ended up at 12,000 feet.
Right, and then it was 30 to 60 degree slopes. So from the crash site, looking up, like you said, it came out to 14,774 feet of the mountain that's the range that they actually hit at. And so this is unfortunate because, you're right there in cloud land and everything. And if you don't have no instrumentation to see what altitude you are, you're not going to be able to know. So I don't think there's anything that you can say was at somebody's fault in that aspect. It's just that mountain's so tall and they lost track. Like you said, they were flying blind.
Well, yeah, it was the wind and the air pockets, and the pilots did make a valiant effort to clear the ridge. Yeah. They sort of aimed for a little notch, and it was this sort of notch that, they clipped the wings against, but they almost cleared it. If they'd been a bit lower, they would have smashed into the face. If they'd been a bit higher, it's not clear what would have happened. I don't think they would have been able to control the flight if they'd actually cleared it, because there were mountains at the other side. because it was sort of like it was like an amphitheater.
Okay.
So the mountains, at the other side after they'd cleared it. So it was probably the only situation that anyone could have survived is that the wings got clipped.
Wow.
So it's quite a, just a very remarkable and 1 in a million chance that they ended up alive.
And looking at this, now that you said that there was a movie, I do remember when I was younger, seeing that show. I didn't realize it until you said the name of it, Alive, but I vaguely remember it. I don't remember all the details, but I can picture, like what you were saying, how excited everybody was as they were getting on this flight. How would you even thought that anything could go wrong? You're flying with the Air Force, you're flying with the Uruguayan Air Force. So we're not talking about untrained people. I would imagine that these are extremely talented and trained pilots.
Well, the pilot had crossed, back and forth about 50 times in similar equipment to what he was flying, and it's not like it was, it was a very modern plane for the time. It's a Fairchild 227 FH227D, I think. It had all the latest instrumentation. Obviously, it didn't have GPS like these days, but they had an instrument called VOR, which was state of the art at the time, and they had 2 of those, and that should allow them to pinpoint exactly where they were at any time.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first day they get hit, they're down on the ground. The plane is destroyed. Was any of the pilots? Did any of the pilots survive, or did they all die on impact?
Well, the co-pilot was flying the plane. He survived the first night, but he was very badly injured. Yeah. The commander of the flight died, not on impact with the mountain, but when the fuselage came to a stop in the valley, it hit a mound of snow. All the seats sort of piled forward, and that's where everyone got injured.
Yeah,
especially on the right-hand side of the plane. So there were people crushed by the seats. There were people who flew into the bulkhead. The bulkhead was destroyed, and the pilot, who was also on the right-hand side, he died on that impact.
Wow, man. So there's another thing, that was unfortunate, because I know at that point, at the point of the story nobody knew that they were going to be there for 70 some days. But now you've lost any military training that they had, because, all the pilots have passed away.
Well, sorry, hold that. There was one mechanic who survived a few days, but he was a little bit in shock.
Yeah.
But the commanders, the pilots had gone. Yeah.
Wow. So this first day, they're all trying to survive the wind and the snow and everything. They're still in the aircraft. They're trying to make room for the injured, and the hope is that they're going to get rescued. So that first night, how many did you say passed away the first night?
It was 5 or 6 passed away that first night. They'd been very badly injured in the crash, and it wasn't unexpected. But what you were left with was you left with 28 people by the next day, who were all except one in reasonable condition. There were I think 3 broken legs. There was one very badly gashed leg. There was some head injuries. But by and large, the majority of those people were okay. Extraordinary.
Wow. So Yeah, I mean, I would be in that same position. I would think, that somebody's coming to rescue us, especially being an Air Force plane. Obviously the government's going to be interested in recovering this aircraft as well. And the first day goes by, you see 5, 6 people pass away, even though in your mind your understanding is from the injuries, not from the elements and everything else. Um, but as far as like trying to get to higher ground to set up some sort of signal or anything like that with these other people injured, that's just not even possible.
Well, I mean, the first, say, three or 4 days, they were working. They took an inventory. They were clearing out the cabin. One of the big things is they were trying to figure out how to make water. Although there was snow all around, you stick it in your mouth, your mouth gets very sore very quickly.
Yeah.
So they were able to use, what little sun there was against a metal plate to melt snow to create water. They got that going, and so on. So they crashed on the Friday. On the Sunday, they had 4 flyovers by rescue planes.
Oh man!
And the last one flew quite low, and these were Chilean and Argentinian rescue planes, because it was basically in the Andes between Chile. Most of the rescue was coordinated by the Chilean Air Force.
Okay.
But the Argentinian Air Force also sent rescue planes up, and Uruguay sent a plane as well. The last one, it wiggled its wings, and they thought, "Oh, great, we've been seen, fantastic. Let's just sit and wait until we're rescued." And then, a day passed, 2 days passed, 3 days passed. People were making, increasingly elaborate excuses as to why the rescue might not have come. Well, it's going to be by land. They've got to prepare. And then some people said, well, why didn't they drop food? Well, maybe they think it will fit, sink in the snow or something, or we wouldn't be able to go and get it. But the realists among them realized that, we've heard the rescue. We've heard the rescue planes going over, and they didn't see us, and they've gone to another part of the mountains to continue the search. And so they started to mount some exploratory expeditions, and they realized, they just couldn't get very far. I mean, they set out, early in the morning. By midday, they'd gone a few, 100 yards up the slope because they were sinking into the snow, and they looked back down and they couldn't see the plane. It's just they realized they couldn't be spotted. Then they started to, of course, think about, well, rescue's not going to come. What are we going to do about food? They started to get pretty hungry.
Yeah.
And they started off there were conversations between close groups of friends, I think we're going to have to use the bodies. And people said, oh no, we can't possibly do that, because these are friends, of course.
Yeah.
And then it gradually turned into an open discussion, and there was a big discussion in the fuselage, and there were 2 medical students who were saying, look, if we don't do this, our bodies are just going to shut down, and we'll die. And there was, being good Catholic boys, there was some sort of religious things. It's your soul has gone from the body, it's just flesh.
Mm-hmm.
Think of it as a communion of some sort. But the thing that finally swung it, to break the taboo, was they made the argument, look, if I die, I'm happy for you to use my body, And because these were all close friends with all the same sort of background, they sort of extrapolated that, their friends would have felt exactly the same way.
Yeah.
And that's really the thing that, at that moment, that was the thing that encouraged them to break the taboo. And then, one of the guys, Fito Strauch, he made the first cut and took a small piece, and then he sort of, encouraged others to do it. And there were probably 4, 5, 6 of them on that first day. This was about day 8 or 9 that took a small piece just to prove to themselves that they could break the taboo.
Yeah.
And then they'd found about that time a small transistor radio, and a couple of days later, although the search was already off by the time they ate, they didn't know it had been called off. They just assumed it had, because they hadn't heard planes for 6, 7 days.
Yeah.
But they heard on this small transistor radio that the search had been called off, and that they wouldn't look again until February. So then everyone started eating, because they realized that that's the only thing to do.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I'm also assuming, just because we were talking earlier, that they were trying to figure out how they were going to come up with to make water.
Yeah.
We're not talking about fires and stuff to be able to cook and prepare. I mean, I hate to say it like that, but we're talking about eating frozen flesh.
Well, yes, it was. There are a couple of things there. Some ate it with snow. There was a bit of wood. They found like a Coca-Cola crate, I think, and there were a couple of other bits of wood. But so on very few occasions they did sort of sear the meat. But they also, another thing is, although it was desperately cold at night, if there wasn't a storm or cloud, then the days could be quite sunny. And so they'd put small slices of meat on the fuselage to sort of heat in the sun, and that helped it as well. But it was it's a terrible thing. 3 of the older boys took it upon themselves to do the cutting from the bodies to protect the younger passengers from the horror of what they were doing, and many of them had had either agricultural backgrounds themselves. They were studying agronomy at university, or because Uruguay is a very there's a lot of countryside and a lot of cattle in Uruguay. So a lot of people, even if they weren't in it themselves, maybe their families had an estancia or a cattle farm. Cutting up meat was not something that some of them were familiar with, that sort of thing. But obviously, it's horrendously different if it's if it's a human body.
Yeah. Wow. I just I've seen some things in my life, but man, I don't know. I mean, I guess at some point your body's going to take instinct and you're going to get over what's preventing you. I just don't know that I could be that person that's man, that is brutal. So we talked, obviously some more people had passed away. Because we'd said earlier that there's 16 people that was
yeah, I mean, some of those passed away later. There's an event that happened later, which we can get to.
Okay. Absolutely. So I guess at this point now, their thoughts is, so they've tried to get to better ground. That didn't work. They now know that they have to make it. They at least know the time frame that they've got to make it to be able to get any help. What is that thought process? Is it literally just, we're going to try to hide out and hang out here until February, or?
No. They started planning an expedition, and
Okay.
they started, building up for it. They're building up their strength. There were two schools of thought. One was it should be a big expedition with most of them trying to get out. Another was that there should be a small team of the fittest going out. And they started making preparations like they were knitting. They had some needles and some thread. One of the ladies who died, had some needles and thread in her luggage. They started knitting mittens from seat covers. They knitted blankets from seat covers. They made sunglasses from bits of perspex, because there are only a few pairs of sunglasses, and you're going to burn your eyes. They'd gone on an expedition about day 8, which had got a lot further than the first expedition. They got right to the top of where the plane had hit, and they'd found the bodies of their friends who'd been sucked out. Wow. But one of them had gone blind from that expedition. So his eyes recovered after a few days, but they knew they needed to have these, these sunglasses and so on. So they were all prepared. They were making more water than they needed, and cutting up meat and stuff like that. And then a second tragedy hit. And this was day 16 or so, I think. So they were lying down to sleep, and it's still quite snug in the fuselage. They made some hammocks for the injured to sleep above the floor, but the rest was sort of sleeping a bit like sardines, one across from each other, on the floor of the fuselage. And they settled down. It was probably early evening, probably around 5:30, 6-ish. And they hear this sudden noise. They're sort of falling asleep, some of them, and this avalanche just sort of engulfs the whole plane. It just sweeps into the back of the plane. They've sort of, built up the back of the plane with suitcases to protect them from the wind and the cold. It just sweeps those all aside and goes into the plane. And it covers everyone except those in the hammocks, and one young man, Roy Harley, who he leaps up, and he's scared that he's sort of the only one, fit person left. But he starts scrambling and digging, and he gets one person out, and then they start digging for others. And by the end of it, after sort of 5 frantic minutes, they take stock, and 8 more of them have died.
Oh my God.
And again, it's mainly those on the right-hand side of the fuselage who were sleeping there, because the fuselage was sort of sloped. They were much more deeply buried.
Yeah.
And then later that night, there's a second avalanche, but it doesn't come into the plane, but it goes over the plane. So if you can imagine, you've got these now 19 survivors at this point. They're stuck in this small space, 3 or 4 feet high, stuck in at the back, stuck in at the front.
Yep.
So they're in this remote valley inside a fuselage in a small space, and the fuselage itself is completely covered with snow. So you cannot imagine a more isolated, situation.
And now your fear is oxygen levels, I mean.
Well, they realized that after some time, and fortunately there's like a metal rod from the fuselage that hasn't been covered miraculously, and they're able to stick it up through a gap in the fuselage up to where they can reach the air.
Yeah.
And that saves the day. But they're stuck inside there for 3 days. There's a storm raging outside for 3 days.
Man.
And eventually they managed to go through the pilot's cabin, past the dead pilot's bodies. They force open, side window in the pilot's cabin, and they tunnel up. And they tunnel up to the surface, and there's this. By the time they tunnel up, it's this beautiful day, and it's just a pristine, snow-covered slope with, I mean, it was like a sort of a rebirth for them.
Yeah. No, I mean, this is where it's going to test your faith in all honesty, because now you're at this point where some people would just give up and others would say, I've survived this much, I can survive more, and this is going to where it's going to go back to your upbringing and your determination. So I do kind of get how some people would look at that and say, wow, look how nice it is. But I can also see how it could also affect the morale at this point. Another attempt that they were planning has now just went to crap, and they're back to square one.
Well, they're back to square one because the bodies are buried.
Yeah.
The water making equipment is buried.
Yep.
All the stuff they got ready for the expedition is buried. They have to dig out, the fuselage. It takes them 2 weeks really to get back to square. Back to where they had been. And another thing that happened is some of the proponents of the sort of big expedition have died in the avalanche. So there's sort of at this point a little bit of a reorganization.
Yeah.
The captain of the rugby team has died, and he was the guy who was leading everything.
Yeah.
So some new leaders emerge, and there's a little society that's formed, which is quite interesting. So you've got they basically say, well, we're going to have 3 or 4 people going to go on the expedition. They're going to be the fittest guys. This guy called Nando Parado, Roberto Canessa, Tintin Vizintin. And then you had a group of 3 cousins, the Strouch cousins, and they took ownership of the sort of the cutting, and they had a sort of a second team around them to do that. Mm-hmm. And then you had people who kept people's spirits up, the jokers, the sort of the spiritual guides and stuff like that. So it was really quite quite an interesting society that formed up there. And in fact, many of your listeners may have heard there's a new film of the event that came out in December called Society of the Snow, from the Society on the Snow. And it's a brilliant film if you get to see it. I mean, I wasn't directly involved in it, although I had some indirect involvement with it. And it just won 12 awards at the Goyas, which is the Spanish version of the Oscars. And it's up for Best Foreign Film at the Oscars.
Wow.
Very worthwhile seeing. It's on Netflix, but if you can see it on the big screen, go and see it. It's a fantastic film. Okay. I mean, it's very authentic. I mean, there's some things are not quite accurate, but it's extremely authentic.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So the society is formed, and now what happens is that the expeditionaries, the people have been set aside to go on the expedition. They're given extra food. They can sleep where they want. They can go to someone and say, I want your sweater, or I want your woolly hat, or I want your boots. And they had to give it to them, because they were going to, everything would depend on these 3 or 4 people. So so they started again, and they set out again sort of in the middle of November, so about a month after so you had like the first 2 weeks, then you had the avalanche, and you've got another 2 weeks where they get ready again. So they finally set out. And they've been gone about 2-3 hours when they find the tail of the plane, which has been, cut off at the ridge. It's actually gone further down the mountain.
Wow.
And this is very interesting for a couple of reasons. One is they have all this that's where most of the suitcases are. So they have all these new clothes. So they have lots of warm clothes.
Yeah.
The second thing is that they find the batteries in the tail, and they think that they'll be able to communicate with the battery. They just need to take the battery to the communication equipment in the pilot's cabin, and maybe they don't have to do an expedition after all. Maybe they can, maybe they can contact the outside world. It becomes very clear that they can't take the battery up to the fuselage, so they decide to go back to the fuselage. They spend a week extracting the radio and all the communication equipment, all the wires, the huge numbers of wires and stuff like that. They go back down to the tail and they spend a week trying to fix it all up. And they get some signal. They can get the motors to work on the communication equipment. They can get the fan to work. They cannot get the transmitter to work. So that wastes another week or so. So they're sort of like 3 weeks later in this sort of attempt at trying to get the radio to work. And meanwhile, 3 other passengers have died from just, their injuries have got the better of them. They got gangrene and pneumonia and stuff like that. So it's sort of around, they decide, well, we'll go in the other direction. There's this massive mountain they have to climb. It's a 3,000-foot wall. They think, so 3 of them set out, I think 12th of December, so about 60 days after they've crashed. This is December in the Southern Hemisphere, so it's sort of springtime, but it's been a very heavy snowfall and it's still sort of wintry conditions.
Yeah.
They set out, they've been able to make a 3-man sleeping bag out of insulation material. They've sewn it together. They get to the top of this headwall. It takes them 3 days to get to the top. And they see nothing but mountains when they get to the top.
Oh, man. Another kick in the nuts.
Another kick in the nuts. So what they do is they send one of them back down to the fuselage and take his rations. And he goes down and tells the others, it takes him like an hour to get down. It's taken them 3 hours to get up.
Yeah.
3 days to get up. So he tells them what's happened. The 2 sort of take the step into the unknown. I mean, it's just incredible bravery. I mean, they presumed they were walking to their deaths, but their reasoning was, look, we'd rather die doing this than die sitting around at the fuselage. So we'll just go. And they really were on their last legs when they about day 7, they got to a valley, which was long, deserted, boulder-strewn valley. And they spent 3 days going down the valley, and eventually they spotted this guy on a horse across this mountain torrent.
Wow.
And he was up in the foothills. He brought his cattle and his sheep and goats up for the summer pasture.
Mm-hmm.
So he hadn't been up there that long, a couple of weeks or so. And he was able to, they exchanged notes across the river, and he was a man of some repute in the area, and he was able to convince the authorities that, that this was for real. This was 72 days after they'd originally crashed.
Wow. So the 2 guys make it 7 days away in traveling to...
Well, it's 10 days to total track, yeah.
10 days total tracking. And at this point, I mean, I can't imagine. I mean, how did the guy on the horse I mean, how far did they have to go to get to another person? I can't imagine there's a bunch of other people up there.
Well, there was some, a few farmhands there helping with some parts. So he sent a couple of them up to help, and they were
Okay.
able to then sort of take them, give them food and so on. But it's about a 35 mile, 35 miles down to the closest village, something like that. So he set off on his mule. So it's about, I don't know, about 8 or 9 miles along a mule track, and then you get to a dirt road. And he started on his mule down that road, and just very fortuitously, he came across a road crew who had come up and were fixing part of the dirt road, because the dirt road sort of sits over a sort of a ravine. It's quite a precarious road, and they had a truck with them, so he tethered his mule and they gave him a ride down. And the rescue operation sort of started that. The preparations were made that evening. It actually happened over the next 2 days. The rescue of the people from the fuselage.
Man. And even still, the people that are going out there still only have an area to find a dot in the snow.
Well, no, they took one of the survivors, Nando Parado, on the helicopter, and he took them most of the way. And then, because they couldn't get over the mountains, they had to sort of take a circuitous route actually into Argentina and come up the valley. And then I think, the crew spotted the plane. And there's some very iconic images of the 14 people back at the fuselage sort of, waving in the air, and, sort of this black and white grainy image.
Man. Wow. I cannot even imagine. I mean, I can't think of anything in my life that would have had the same type of joy at that time,
Yeah.
I mean, they probably had ice all over their chin from the tears. Yeah.
Well, I mean, by that time, I mean, in December, you're getting towards summer, and the days actually were getting quite hot.
Oh, that's right. So they're on the opposite season as.
Yeah.
That's right.
So when they crashed, it was October, which is sort of the end of winter, but it had been a very harsh winter with the biggest snowfall for many decades. And it was that really that sort of saved them when the sort of fuselage was tobogganing down. Because there are huge numbers of very big rocks on that slope down from the ridge, but there was so much snow that year that they managed to avoid them all. So a lot of things had to come together.
And not to mention, so your food source for 2 months has been the people that had passed away. Had this same accident happen in summertime, that they wouldn't have had that meat.
No, I mean, even if someone had survived the plane crash, then you wouldn't, the bodies would have decayed. But on the other hand, you would have had a much easier walk out of there.
That is true.
Yeah.
Yep. And they probably wouldn't have been there for 72 days had that been, because that's also probably only reason why the original search got called off was because of the weather and everything else.
Yeah, I mean, it's precarious doing the search. A rescue would have been precarious, and never in all the accidents that occurred in that part of the Andes. And I've looked at reports from the search and rescue team from that area, and the maybe 25 accidents, no one's ever survived. So there was no point in risking rescue team personnel to find corpses.
I know a few rugby players, not no professional, but people that play on clubs and stuff like that. And all of them that I know are very type A personality. It is a very rough sport. It is cause you need a lot of endurance and strength to play rugby. I played a couple times. I will be the first to admit that it is way rougher than American football. And I wonder how much that being a rugby club that helped in some of this living, just because of they had to be in shape to be playing rugby. They probably already had that type A personality of wanting to succeed, and so I kind of wonder, had this been a group of cheerleaders, would the outcome have been the same? Because they made a lot of tough decisions.
Well, so I think that there's several aspects here that are relevant to your question. Certainly, rugby is a team about solidarity, determination,
Yep.
Giving your all for the team, and so on. And those are all critical aspects on the mountain.
Yeah.
It's worth saying that the school that they all, because not all of them were rugby players. Some of them were friends. Some of them had played rugby at school and didn't play rugby anymore, and so on. But they'd all gone to the same school, and the school was founded by the Irish Christian Brothers.
Mm-hmm.
And the Irish Christian Brothers introduced rugby to the school, and they were adamant that it was essential for the molding of a complete person to play rugby because it taught you so many values.
I don't.
So even if you weren't a rugby player, you will have gone through that same molding of character.
Yeah.
So I think there was generally that character, strong character on the mountain. Another aspect is just the fitness. So the three who set off to get out of there were all rugby players. And, I should point out that many of the rugby players actually died in the accident. So of the people who came out of the back of the plane, a lot of the rugby players were sitting at the back of the plane.
Yeah.
And they were the ones who came out. So, several very important members of the club lost their lives within the first couple of days. And so even though the rugby team was much reduced, it was the fitness of the rugby players that allowed them to be part of the expeditions.
Wow. Well, let's get into a little bit of your time when you went down there. Did you actually go to like the crash site and places like that, or when you went
Yeah.
down
So
there?
in 2013, I went. So it's 2 days. So you approach from the Argentinian side. It's 2 days on horseback, and you go in summer. So even though there's snow in January when I've been, there's snow up on the glacier. Although it's depleted a lot since those days. If you go in December, of course, or November, there's a lot of snow. But yeah, I've slept up at the glacier where they were. There's a grave, a shallow grave up there where all the remains have been buried. There's a couple of monuments. There's a cross. There's lots and lots of plaques that people have left. In fact, there's a steady pilgrimage every summer, which is getting bigger and bigger as the years go by, of people who want to go up there, and it has a very special energy up there. It's first of all, it's very iconic. So people have seen pictures of the site, and to actually get there and see the mountains, which are sort of etched in some people's minds, to see those is quite special. And because you're sort of approaching very slowly on horseback, it's very quiet. I mean, it's a magnificent place to visit. Yeah. It does bring out emotions in people, and I've seen people crying by the grave, quite openly, just weeping away, sobbing.
I can see that.
Yeah.
I mean, wow. An area that people go back to visit that is probably so beautiful now. What is still edged in nightmares and others. And I don't know how many people believe in, spiritual type things, but, I do believe in things like trauma and stuff can be passed through other people. There's energies and everything else. So I don't think that you would have had to have been close to this to feel that energy when you're up there,
Well,
just
yeah, I mean, so people, people who are unrelated to the story, but just interested, they get very emotionally affected. And you can imagine, the families of those who died going up there. So one, for example, a mechanic, Carlos Roque, who died in the avalanche. His son, he had a 1.5-year-old son who, at the time of the accident, obviously now he's in his 50s, early 50s. So he went up there again, and he said, the emotions were just incredible. He was approaching this just incredibly beautiful and meaningful place, but it was a place for him of such pain. But he said when he was up there at the grave, he just he felt closer to his father than he had ever done.
Yeah, I can completely get that. I mean, that makes perfect sense. And it's not like you could just go down to the local cemetery either. I mean, this is planning and working to get to this area. It's not like you're just going to walk down the street. So that in itself, the journey of getting there, probably also is part of where the emotions come from. Man.
Yeah, it's like you're entering a different epoch or something. It's like sort of there's a real isolation there from from the real world, and it's accentuated by the slow sort of horse ride up there, the sound of clatter of hooves against rocks. You're going very slowly. You've got your thoughts to yourself. So you're sort of going through this passage from one world to another world, and that just accentuates the feeling you get when you get up there.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Wow. Like I said, I remember seeing the movie, but now hearing this story and talking to you, I don't think that movie really puts that same feeling into comparison. Wow.
I mean, I think you'd find this new movie that's come out by Spanish director Juan Antonio Bayona. I think really does put it in a better perspective.
You're talking about the one called Snow City?
Society of the Snow, yeah. Society of the Snow.
Yeah. I'm gonna check that one out too. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, one of the things that I've been interested in, and which is partly addressed by Society of the Snow, partly addressed by a documentary that I was advisor for by E18, and certainly addressed by my book, is really the families of those who died. Because if you can imagine, the survivors came back, everyone thought they were dead, except remarkably, the search that the parents did for their kids went on through those two and a half months.
Yeah,
I mean, it's a quite incredible story in its own right, which I cover in my book, obviously. And many of the mothers believe had this sort of instinct that their sons were alive, and it turns out that by and large, I mean, it's not exclusively, but for a lot of them, the mothers who thought their sons were alive, they actually were alive, and those who thought they were dead, they were dead. It's quite extraordinary. I mean, there are exceptions to that. But one extraordinary story is one of the mothers was very active in the parent search after the official search had been called off, and they were going in small planes and on horseback and mule and so on. She had gone with a one of the other mothers, and spent several days searching. And she, all of a sudden, on 31st of October, she said, "Search is over for me. I don't want to know anything more about this." And that was the day her son died in the avalanche.
Wow. And again, I think that's energy. I do believe there's so much about it that we don't know yet. And I think energy, you hear the same thing with twins, how bonded and connected they really are.
Yeah.
Did they recover the wreckage or did they leave the wreckage up there?
No, the wreckage is up there. But I mean, it's disappeared into a crack in the glacier. I think if you go up there when there's no snow, which I haven't been, I believe you can still see some of it. They're bits and pieces. Like there's a tail wing, there's a window, there's bits of curtain, there's bits of fabric, and various rods and nuts and bolts and stuff like that on a pile near the grave. People finding stuff all the time, little artifacts every year, and so on. There's this Mexican-American mountaineer I was talking about. He had, along with an Argentinian climber, found the jacket of one of the survivors high up near the crash, where the plane hit the mountain, and has still had his money and his ID card in.
Wow.
So there's lots of things like that. They had a burial a month after the accident, and did the best job they could, but snow was still melting, so there's still lots of remains around. One of the parents decided to go. His son had died quite near the end, and decided to go and get the remains of his son. And he was he worked with some Argentinian guides to go up to the site early on, and he did recover what he could of his son's remains, and brought them back to Uruguay.
Wow.
That's an extraordinary story, again, that I cover in my book. But what I wanted to say was really, so these survivors, all of a sudden, these people, 16, were born again. But for the people who died, they died again, right? Because the parents heard, look, they're 16 survivors, so everyone immediately thinks, well, maybe my son or my brother or my, he's one of them. So, and then they hear the list. The list is read out over the radio and broadcast in Uruguay of the 16 names, and so everyone was just counting out the names, and you get to the end, and your son, your brother's not on there.
Yeah,
they've died again. And so these survivors came back, these sort of heroes, into this very close-knit community, and they're still living side by side, even to this day, by the families of those who died. And so it's a very fraught situation, and it was, for many, many years, it was easier just not to talk about, the tragedy, because survivors didn't want to talk about it because they didn't want to bring up bad, memories for those who'd lost their son.
Yep.
And the families, several families who lost someone, it was taboo to talk about it within the family.
Yeah.
There were various coping mechanisms, but it was a very unprecedented situation. It's sort of like having a school shooting or something in a very small community, but this is something that has all these other dimensions of being drawn out over such a long time, and such exceptional circumstances. The plane crash, the avalanche, the trek, all these remarkable things that happened, and using the bodies is just one, probably one of the least interesting of the the aspects of this story.
You're right. And yeah, that does make complete sense of, why. I mean, I don't know that I would ever felt comfortable talking about that part of it with the family members. Nobody wants to know about, you know, what really happened to their kids or their parents or aunts and uncles, whatever family members you're talking about. I guess there could also be an understanding, a silent understanding of what had to happen for the people to survive.
Well,
But
yeah, I mean, they knew what had happened, but I mean, and there were sort of different reactions from the family. Some were just remarkably supportive. I mean, one father said, "Look, I knew from the beginning that if they survived it, you know, this was the only thing they could have done, and I'm
yeah,
happy that 16 survived, so that so I'm glad that there were 45 people on the flight, so that 16 families had their son back, and his son had died,
yeah,
on day one." There's another, um, you know, mother and father who said, "Look, we feel it's our mission to help these survivors overcome, this psychological ordeal, to
yeah,
help them live their lives and sort of come back from this and not be overwhelmed by this sort of, what the world sort of imposes their view." Because the headlines, were not nice to begin with when it came out what they'd done.
yeah. They
But
they wanted that shock to get people to listen and watch.
yeah.
Man. Yeah, I get that. You see it a lot in the podcasting world as well. That shock statements to get people to listen or read or subscribe or whatever you're trying to get. And then the whole story doesn't come out. You get that shock portion of it, and then a few underlying things to justify that.
Yeah.
And it's not like they're going to be able to do any hunting. I mean, it wasn't like they had a bunch of guns with them and the energy and ability to track down mountain goats or anything else like that.
Yeah.
There wasn't any other options.
There was no life up there at all.
No,
Nothing. Not a
no.
thing.
And again, the history, like you said, every crash up to that point, there's never been a survivor. Never.
Right.
Oh, absolutely. Well, John, why don't I bring you forward and let you tell everybody where they can find your book and how they can reach out to you, and maybe even if they'd like to go on this journey, how they could set up a tour to go down and check this out.
Sure. Well, you can get my book from Amazon, or it's also on Google Play Books, or you can order it at your bookstore. If you want to find a set of links, go to https :/John Guiver JOHNGUIVER.org/books. You can see it on the screen there. That gives links to Amazon and to Google Play Books if you prefer a digital copy. As regards going to the site of the accident, if you need to get in touch with me, there's a form that you can fill on my website, johnguiver.org, where you can contact me. Also, there's a chapter in the book which talks about trips to the mountain, current day trips to the mountain, which gives quite a lot of information. So depending on, whether you can speak Spanish or not, and so on. So yeah, johnguiver.org.
All right. Well, man, I appreciate you coming on. I knew this was going to be a fascinating story, and I learned so much more than I knew at the beginning of it. And knowing the people that listen and follow, I'm sure that they are going to get a lot out of this as well. If you don't mind, I'll put you in the green room. We'll throw the exit video out, and I'll be with you in a second.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Wow, what a story, man. Putting yourself in those decisions, the key decisions that had to be made to get alive, stay alive, and get home to your family. I know in the veteran community, we all talk about things that we did and went through, and the stuff that led up to us getting back. And a lot of us even say the same thing. I don't even know how we made it back alive sometimes, but I don't know any of us that's probably had to make these kind of decisions. I mean, there was not a single thing that went right for them for the most part. Everything, as I said earlier, was just like just another kick in the nuts. So I hope y'all enjoyed this story. I get fascinated with history, so I love history stories, especially somebody that's so educated as John here on the topic. So I hope y'all enjoyed it. I know I did, and I want y'all to remember: don't let the day kick your ass, kick its ass.